She was a shining light of our age, a woman greater than any man, a second Deborah among the sons of Israel, who, with a man's courage and a woman's constancy, defended the Church of God. Chronicler Donazone in his work entitled Vita Matildis. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history, warts and all, unabashedly and unashamed. This season, or bend in the narrative as I call it, is called All Roads Lead to Clermont, and it attempts to bring us up to date on the West leading right up to the call for Holy War. We followed the reign of King William II of England and his two brothers, Robert Curthose and Henry Beauclerc, up north, and taken a quick snapshot of Iberia crumbling under the weight of the Almoravid conquest already. In addition to those, we've also established the two major thoroughfares that Crusaders would be using in the coming confrontation: the Venetian-controlled Adriatic and the Kingdom of Hungary. And with this episode, we see an emperor on the run and a countess reclaiming her rightful heritage. But her victory over Henry IV at Canossa in 1092 went farther than just repelling that German back north. After her victory at Canossa, Matilda, for all intents and purposes, became an absolute queen without a crown. She was feared, revered, and fully devoted to her dying breath the ideals of Pope Gregory VII. And with Henry running away north, the world was put on notice of this fierce Tuscan woman. So what's next for Matilda? Well, in her newfound glory and fame, she gets to swing her undisputed influence a little more widely. She gets to push the bounds of what constituted a noblewoman's place 1,000 years ago, and she gets to continue to play politics with the heaviest of hitters in the medieval world. And Pope Urban II had just the thing to let her scream her autonomy from the peak of her mountaintop fortress. Matilda was given the honor of hosting Urban's biggest meeting yet. But where should it be held? Now, before we begin, if you believe what's happening on this show, bringing our shared history to life, warts and all, free to the public, and with absolutely no more paywalls, ever, please consider donating to my caffeine-mediated research and writing through the website and app Buy Me a Coffee. With opportunities for one-time donations and even a monthly donation plan, which will be opening soon, you can voluntarily contribute to the continuation of this show. And while you're at it, feel free to listen on YouTube as well, which has our full back catalog as well as new episodes. These links are in the show notes. Now, this is episode 163, entitled Exorcising Her Demons. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Milan, Piacenza, Cremona. These German-backed bishoprics were at the tip of Matilda's spear as bishoprics who formally and publicly seceded from Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV's Germanic realm. They didn't immediately join Matilda's Gregorian camp, but their break and creation of their own secular and ecclesiastical alliance, called La Liga, or the League, was enough to shake the very foundation of the empire. If Henry was still marking 1077 as his most humiliating defeat, he should probably rethink it. 1092 was an immediate contender for that title now. And by the beginning of the year 1093, Matilda and La Liga entered into a formal alliance with one another. Not perfectly aligned along Gregorian lines. Rather, it was an alliance based on the age-old concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this move wasn't just a forgotten episode in history either. Michelle K. Spike, in her book Tuscan Countess, that I've referenced countless times on the show already, well, she writes, quote, "In 1984, Umberto Bossi, The flamboyant separatist leader of the northern Italian right echoed that secession when he formed his party, the Lombard League. End quote. Dear listeners, be vigilant. History is all around us all the time. So, in 1092, Henry lost everything he had gained since his famous walk to Canossa rebound back in 1077. And I mean just about everything, at least down in Italy, for sure. And once again, who was at the head of his humiliation and cataclysmic fall? Matilda of Canossa. And though Matilda may have been the face of his humiliation, things began to cut deeper. Far, far deeper, actually. Matilda's purview was, for all intents and purposes, northern Italy. And who was living his entire childhood, pretty much, in northern Italy? Co-king of Germany, Conrad III, Henry IV's firstborn son and heir. Now, throughout the late 1080s, Conrad was drinking Matilda's flavor of Kool-Aid rather than his dad's, and by 1092, Conrad was poised to stand up to the old man. In 1093, Conrad did just that. Conrad officially broke from Henry and publicly joined Matilda's pro-Gregorian cause. And to add insult to injury, a little salt to the wound, Eupraxia, Cressida, Adelaide, whatever you want to call Henry's new empress. Well, she spoke out against him and wished to side with Matilda and her great fight against the emperor. Now, after Canossa, Henry hightailed his tattered forces back to the fair city of Verona, which was only tenuously still loyal to him. So, this would be far easier if this were a visual medium, but alas, it is not. Not yet, anyway. Maybe someday. Now, let's lay it out for you like this. Henry was in Verona, which was the major point from which one could trek north into the Alps toward Brenner Pass, the safest and quickest way across the mighty Alps, that is. And to his west was Milan, Piacenza, Cremona, and Parma, who had all just left him after his defeat at Canossa. To his south in Verona, to his south of there was the River Po, cutting through a vast verdant plain that only held a handful of loyal towns. Mantua was one of them, but being Matilda's birthplace and sometimes home, well, Mantua's loyalty was without question a forced one. Beyond the Po was the Apennine mountain range, with its steep cliffs and mountaintop fortresses, such as the one at Canossa, that Matilda was now standing proudly atop, gazing north, with a determined smile on her face. Fun fact, by the way, I found this out just looking on Google Maps. This region today is still known as Terra di Matilda, or Land of Matilda. So even 1,000 years later, here is Matilda, showing herself to us. Now, to Henry's east in Verona, to his east were towns and villages and cities who've stayed largely out of the fray thus far, having leaned toward relations with either Matilda or Venice. So he was really not going to find any friends either way. And the nail in his coffin, in 1093, was the fact that he was holed up in that Verona city, the only viable place from which to start his trek to Brenner Pass. But since Canossa, Matilda's father-in-law, Guelph IV, had plugged the gap at Brenner Pass with anti-imperial soldiers. Yeah, so he's got Bavarians coming down to stop him from crossing. Between the years 1092 and 1097, yes, those 5 full years, Emperor Henry IV was essentially pinned inside the city of Verona with nowhere to escape. Matilda's priest and biographer, Donizone, who we quoted at the top of the show, he once mocked him, Spike tells us, by nicknaming Henry Perdicausa, or the Lost Cause. What's more is that by late 1093, Henry could no longer support his anti-pope, Clement III, back in Rome. He had no forces with which to break through to Germany. How would he ever make it to Rome to support Clement? He summoned Clement III to Verona for safekeeping, thus evacuating Rome for Pope Urban II to enter the city for the first time. Yes, the first time since Urban's election to the papacy back in 1088. Now, to be sure, he stayed in the Isola Tiberina for a while inside Rome because it was staunchly pro Matilda, as it was owned by the Pierleoni family. Now, Gregory VII was intimately tied to the Pierleonis, remember? So, you see the connection. However, after just 2 years in 1094, Rome cleaned itself up and opened itself up to the possibility of Urban living in the Lateran Palace and holding masses in St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Urban II's first Mass at St. Peter's was on Christmas Day of 1094, 6 years after he was elected Pope. Now, all the while, Henry was reduced to nothing but words. Spike tells us that his biographer called Matilda, quote unquote, that grasping woman. But he was essentially only powerful enough to keep his enemies away from Verona. That's all he could do. He was neutered of any real imperial power and authority, and he and his antipope were licking their wounds again for those 5 years up in Verona. And Spike writes, quote, in the space of 3 years, Matilda pulled off a coup d'etat against Henry in Italy by being everywhere. She worked with inexhaustible energy, and her efforts were devastating to the king. In chronological order, she encouraged the rebellion of Henry's firstborn son and heir, Conrad III. She engineered the abandonment of Henry by his second wife, Cressida. She prepared a public relations extravaganza at Piacenza, brought the bishops and northern Italian laity to meet Pope Urban II. She urged Urban to follow through with Gregory's plan and save Jerusalem from the infidel. Matilda's persistence and devotion to the memory of the man she loved were simply extraordinary. End quote. So, where are we by 1094? That was a whole lot of jumping around, I understand. Now, Conrad, living in rambunctious and rebellious pro-Gregorian northern Italy nearly all of his formative years, he was allied with Matilda. And the Italians decided to reward the young man with the title of King of Italy. Yeah, they completely revoked the title, at least in name, from Henry and gave it to Conrad. Now, Matilda sent her own troops up to Germany to extract Empress Adelaide, and it was successful. Adelaide and Matilda were living safely in Canossa. Spike writes, quote, in tears, Cressida denounced Henry IV to Matilda, accusing him of infidelity, sexual deviance, and violent and humiliating abuse, both physical and sexual. End quote. And along with Adelaide, Matilda also formally dissolved her second marriage to the Penguin, Guelph V, most likely because she was still pretty livid about the fall of Mantua. A woman scorned, Matilda had always proved herself a formidable opponent to anyone who crossed her, including people who may have done nothing objectively wrong. She expected loyalty to the death. Guelph IV ran away from Mantua. To her, this was on par with the most depraved abuse a husband could impose on a wife and was reasonable grounds for a divorce. She contended that the marriage was never consummated, which, given Matilda's attitude toward anyone other than Gregory, it's certainly possible. She erased Guelph V the best she could because, as Spike writes, quote, references to Guelph in Italy simply ended after April 1095, the date of the last document they signed together. End quote. Now, besides, Guelph in Bavaria had nothing else to offer her. There were rumors about his homosexuality and his inability to stand up to his fierce wife and all of that, but I agree with Spike that this was a marriage of convenience, nothing more. She had defeated Henry once again. He was no longer a threat, so the marriage was dissolved. Simple. Spike writes, quote, she only had one concern, for herself, to govern Bonifacio's lands on behalf of a man on St. Peter's throne who would implement Gregory's reforms. End quote. Can't sum it up better than that, I suppose. And speaking of a man on St. Peter's throne who would implement Gregory's reforms, speaking of him, Pope Urban II was now administering Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, and Rome was more or less at peace, albeit still rebuilding. That's where we are by 1094. But Matilda wasn't just exacting revenge or collecting stray royals like medieval Pokemon. She was building a papal power base. Or, I should say, she was rebuilding a papal power base. See, Urban wasn't quite at the level that we know him to be yet today. He was certainly respected and honored wherever he went. He was certainly, by 1094 at least, acknowledged as the rightful pope in Rome. And he was certainly making his papal ambitions pretty clear. But he wasn't the ideological juggernaut who launched a crusade, not quite yet. She and Urban had always seen eye to eye on the direction of the church, but allying oneself is different than having a power base. A conversation or treaty can ally oneself to another, but one must cultivate a power base. It must be nurtured from its seed to its seasonal flowering. And this is what Matilda and Urban were doing between 1092 and 1095. This rebuilt and rejuvenated papal power base was a new axis of control stretching from Rome all the way to the Alps. One castle, one bishop, and one bastard son of an emperor and his stepmom at a time. And Urban? Urban was watching all this with the same gleeful detachment as a poker player who's just drawn a royal flush. The chessboard was set. Henry IV was a political leper north of the Alps, and in Italy, he was barely a rumor. Matilda held her father's lands once again, with the notable exception of Mantua, of course, and a smattering of nearby towns and villages, as we said, which, make no mistake, certainly needled her to no end. She wanted Mantua back. To pour buckets of salt on Henry's imperial wounds, his heir Conrad III now held his crown of Italy. I mean, the man didn't even have a wife to lean his head on. She too was with Matilda. And Urban held Rome, the spiritual trump card. But Urban needed to make it official. Like in a big way. He just needed everyone to be aware of his supremacy over Henry. He needed to make it big, visible, and very public. So, what do you do when you've clawed your way back from exile, outmaneuvered your imperial enemies, and you're sitting on the most explosive geopolitical ecclesiastical powder keg of the century? Hell, for a few centuries, actually. Well, you throw a party, a very, very big party, with bishops and lords and sobbing Byzantine envoys. Urban, he just needed a venue. Now, when choosing a place for a party, the same today went for folks 1,000 years ago. A few things have to be considered when you throw a banger, especially one with potential implications like Urban was planning. For one, it has to be safe. Now, speaking politically, dangers abound, whether you're talking about Dallas, Texas, or Butler County, Pennsylvania, whether you're trying to grab a sandwich in Sarajevo or catching a play at a local theater in Washington, D.C., or trying to give a speech to some senators who hate you with the passion of 1,000 suns. The number one concern for large gatherings is, of course, security. Heck, just a couple of years ago, First Lady Jill Biden visited the high school across the street from where I teach, and that building had Secret Service there long before she ever got on the plane for the visit, as they should have been, of course. Security is number one, always has been, always will be. Now, 1,000 years ago, when holding a gigantic event like the one Pope Urban II was planning, security was an interesting challenge to overcome in the year 1095. I mean, technically, Emperor Henry IV was still, at least in his mind, the king of Italy. Heck, he was even still in Italy, in Verona, as I said, albeit holed up and neutered as a threat, but he was still present despite his rebellious son being crowned the king of Italy by actual Italians. Henry was still present. Either way, security was tricky. Is the town fortified? Can it handle a large number of loyal troops? Can these troops be trusted to behave? Is it under the control of someone who can be trusted to keep the general peace? There's a lot to think about. Now, the next concern when trying to hold a huge event, at least one that will take days and days, like the World Cup, the Olympics, the Super Bowl, or even Burning Man and Coachella, the venue has to be logistically smart. Can the town support potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of attendees? Can the town rise to the challenge of proper lodging, clean and abundant food, open spaces to allow people to have, some elbow room to relax, not be down each other's throats all the time? And let's be honest, you're going to need a lot of churches 1,000 years ago. So can the town provide for the spiritual needs of those in attendance too? And by God, this is a Pope's event, a major one. The symbolism has to be on point. Now, put a pin in the symbolism for now. We'll get to it. Now, addressing each of these concerns, one can see that holding events 1,000 years ago, or today even, is all about location, location, location. So let's address each one of these: security, logistics, and symbolism. Well, the only real option had to be in northern Italy. It's not only where the chosen king of Italy was living, but it couldn't be Rome. Now, why not Rome? Poor Rome had been through enough in the 11th century. Rome had seen its fair share of visitors, you could say, from German supporters of Clement III to Norman knights from down south. Urban couldn't risk flooding Rome with supporters of his, not while he was still in his honeymoon period with them. They've accepted him. That was perfect for the moment. Rome was still too fragile for such a massive event. So, northern Italy it was. Good. We've got a region. Now, you'd think that northern Italy would be a lightning rod for assassination attempts and the like. But see, once again, that's where Matilda comes in. Northern Italy, at least the Duchy of Tuscany, which was a larger region back then, was under Matilda's control once again. Remember, with Henry's defeat at Canossa in 1092, 3 years earlier, and with the formation of La Liga, Tuscany, Duke Bonifacio's old lands, once again returned to Matilda's direct sphere of influence. I say influence and not control because, also remember, Matilda gave her entire realm to the papacy in perpetua. It was technically Urban's, but Matilda was the boss in those parts, and people looked to her for guidance and leadership, not necessarily the Pope. The popes have come and popes have gone, but Matilda had always been there. Matilda's Tuscany was once again fiercely loyal to her, and she could ensure Urban's and his guests' safety while they were there. In fact, she raised an army to support such measures. So, Tuscany was the chosen region. But where inside Tuscany could Urban trust to be the safest while he was showing his guests a pretty good time? Hey, back then a good time did actually include not dying of dysentery or being raided on the highway into the city. It also had to be located along well-traveled routes. And what better routes than rivers and pilgrimage routes, right? Tuscany had a few options there. But there was one city that really rose to the top. It was fortified with high walls. It was large with open spaces around the city, and it was home to a large population of Matilda loyalists. It lay along major routes and a major river, implying that it already had an infrastructure ready to hold an influx of people coming to see the Pope, though it would struggle mightily to keep up, to be honest. Anywhere would have struggled with what's about to happen. Now, you may be thinking that I've been building up to Clermont, right? Well, anyone that knows anything about Pope Urban II knows he gave his famous speech kickstarting the First Crusade at the town of Clermont. But little did I know when I started researching this that it wasn't so simple as that. Urban didn't just travel to Clermont, give a speech, and poof, tens of thousands of Frenchmen and their families were crossing Europe toward the Holy Land. As this bend in our narrative is titled, we are on the road to Clermont. At this point in the narrative, we're still in early 1095, and the planning for this event had been in the works for months and months already. Now, By the end of 1095, we will, dear friends, at last come to Urban's fiery speech at Clermont. But 1095, it was a long, long year. It was a whirlwind of speaking, councils, traveling, and building a case for not just crusading, but for people to follow the Bishop of Rome even more firmly than before, which, of course, is a core tenet of Gregorian reforms. So we're not to Clermont yet. Besides, for those of you who know your maps really well, we're still triangulating the perfect location in Italy, and Clermont is in France, so there's that. But Clermont soon. Very, very soon, I promise. But not yet. Little did I know before getting into all this that 1095 was kicked off in what Urban and his supporters figured to be the perfect location for a gigantic council. Again, trade routes crisscrossing it, a major pilgrimage route cutting right through it, and a river. It was a mid-sized city in Tuscany. Not Milan, not Florence, not Pisa, that would house a massive influx of people. Italians, Normans, Germans, French, and yes, even Byzantines. Archbishops and bishops, along with their own cadres of accompanying clergy and monks and chroniclers, bands of knights and their feudally obligated men, many of them on horseback with extra horses to boot, while even more simple farmers turned infantrymen were also in tow. Whole families of nobility and their attending servants, and packs of onlookers from far and wide. All of these people would descend upon the mid-sized Tuscan city of Piacenza. Now, why Piacenza? Well, to detail out what I've already mentioned, Piacenza was at the time mostly located on the southern banks of the powerful River Po that cuts right through northern Italy. The Po River and the Po Valley pretty much define northern Italy as we know it, at least, geologically. And the Po River has a wide number of tributaries that connect folks as far away as Aosta, Turin, Cuneo, Asti, Milan, Mantua, Parma, and Modena. And again, Piacenza was right there along the Po, so folks traveling the waterways found getting to Piacenza rather easy, all things considered. But beyond the river systems, Piacenza, or at least the towns and villages that would coalesce over the years to become Piacenza, was a common stopping point between north and south as far back as the Roman Republic. And by the 11th century, Piacenza sat right along many ancient Roman roads that never seemed to go out of use. If one were to travel from the Adriatic coast, one could jump on the Via Aemilia, which ran from Rimini straight through Piacenza, linking Piacenza to major cities like Ravenna and Venice. Passes through the Apennine Mountains seemed to converge at Piacenza as well, connecting Piacenza to all southern Italian markets and ports, such as Florence, Pisa, and Rome, and as far south as Norman and Lombard ports of Amalfi and Salerno, among others. But by far the most important road to cut through Piacenza was the famous pilgrimage route called the Via Francigena, which linked Rome to Canterbury, England. Yes, across the channel in Canterbury. The vast majority of the Via Francigena passed through France, hence its name. And, a great many traders and bishops and armies would utilize this route throughout history, up to the modern day when paved roads and highway systems began to emerge. In fact, given the importance of paths like the Via Francigena, one can assume the earliest Normans back in 1016 probably used that path and passed right through Piacenza on their way to one of Apulia's southern ports. They were on a pilgrimage, remember. Now, given the waterways and the well-worn dirt paths crossing right through the city, Piacenza was an ideal spot to connect Christendom once again under the banner of Rome's bishop. But Piacenza had far more to offer than its connections to the larger world. Piacenza was ancient, like deeply, deeply ancient. Romans founded the riverside port way back in 218 BC under the name Placentia. and it was a terminal for the aforementioned Via Aemilia, connecting the inner peninsula in the north to the Adriatic Sea. It endured Carthaginian sieges and Gallic attacks. I mean, this place took a beating throughout the ages, but it held all the same. By the 800s AD, Frankish rule established control over the Longbeards, that is, the Lombards, and Piacenza reemerged as a regional hub of activity. After the year 1000, Piacenza was booming from the ramped up pilgrimage industry, which brought along elevated merchant traffic. Piacenza was a jewel of Matilda's Tuscany, that's for sure. A little jewel, but a jewel all the same. Now, after the turn of the first millennium, Piacenza shifted, as did many northern Italian cities in those days, cities like Milan, Turin, Genoa, Florence, Pisa, and Venice. It shifted from a bishop-governed polity to a merchant-governed commune. This is something we're going to get into soon enough after we talk about the First Crusade, or the North Italian communes. But by 1095, Piacenza was very much a commune of this type, a merchant-governed commune. In fact, Matilda had granted Piacenza full commune status by the mid-1090s. This resulted, like those other cities I mentioned in northern Italy, in a dramatic drop in feudal obligations and power, giving Piacenza and northern Italy itself quite the rebellious, independent-minded streak at the time. Heck, even episcopal power waned in these cities as locals freely elected their own consuls. This allowed many Piacentines to expand from an agrarian community with a strong merchant class to a strong ruling merchant class heavily influenced by a new class of bankers and wealthy businessmen. In fact, a number of Piacentini bankers were turning some real profits already in 1095 over in Genoa. This was a guild-driven urbanism forming in Piacenza, and the never-ending stream of pilgrims from north of the Alps did nothing but feed the ravenous maw of commerce there. These tourists and traveling merchants almost completely funded civic and religious building sprees beginning mid-century. So by 1095, Piacenza was actually that little shiny jewel in Matilda's imaginary crown I mentioned earlier. These building projects that would help with the influx of urban attendees, including a basilica that stood where the modern-day Duomo stands today, an abbey just outside the walls, as well, and the Santa Maria di Campagna, which is Renaissance in style, but traditions hold that Urban II announced for Crusade here, which is why it has the name Crusade Square. Unfortunately, that's just fanciful tradition, though. No, to be clear, Piacenza was not the city Urban II officially called for Crusade, but more on that later. Hate to burst the Piacentini's bubble there, but... Now, Piacenza had it all, it seemed. It was a ready-made city capable of handling a serious uptick in visitors and dignitaries, but more than any of that, with Emperor Henry IV still stuck in Verona to the north, Piacenza served a far deeper, more symbolic place. Piacenza would hold the event of the century, so far as they had planned it anyway. And who would once again be at the top of this middle finger to Emperor Henry IV? None other than Matilda of Canossa, who would also be in attendance, along with most of her loyal priests, who spent the last several years exiled by Henry and his ilk. They spent it on her mountaintop fortress with her. In fact, Matilda played such an important role in the whole affair that historical records indicate that Urban himself called it, in one of his letters, the Council of Piacenza under the protection of Matilda. That is a quote. Her troops, her logistics, her influence, her loyalists within the city and in the surrounding lands. Matilda ensured Piacenza was safe, and it was available, and it would be a tremendous venue for what Urban was needing. Urban trusted Matilda to ensure local bishops were reform-minded and supportive. And Matilda, at every single last turn, did not fail him. She provided more than just political cover, though. Her support meant urban planning, ecclesiastical calibration, and military safety, all giving Urban the confidence to unleash and reiterate sweeping reforms, knowing he stood on ground strengthened by the strongest papal ally north of the Apennines. Arguably, let's just say it, the strongest papal ally that entire century. Matilda made all of this possible. Matilda was free to leave her mountaintop fortress at long last. But no matter where she went, no matter where Henry went, no matter who was pope, the events of Canossa in both 1077 and 1092 would cast a very, very long shadow. But Matilda saw Piacenza through a different lens than others, a much, much more personal lens. According to Michelle Spike, quote, "It was a gutsy choice," end quote, referring to Matilda's choice of Piacenza. But as always, Matilda saw things differently than most others. As for her lands throughout Tuscany, the lands she had held onto for decades as her rightful inheritance from her father, Duke Bonifacio of Tuscany, well, Piacenza would serve as something symbolically profound, whether others noticed it or not. Spike continues, quote, "The League had given Matilda an edge, and she was determined to use it. A Gregorian bishop had just been installed a year and a half before in this city that had previously caused her nothing but grief. Here, Henry III had summoned Gregory VI in 1046. Here, Hildebrand had lost his defense of his great-uncle's election. Here, Henry III had received the famously ostentatious gift of balsamic vinegar from Bonifacio, who was doomed by it. Here, in the heart of Lombardy, was the city Matilda chose to vindicate all her ghosts." End quote. Again, whether anyone noticed the deeper, more personal reasons Matilda held for choosing Piacenza, no one knows, and we never will. But to Matilda, it didn't matter one bit. Piacenza would serve to exorcise the many German-caused demons who had plagued her throughout her life. Gregory VI's condemnation, Hildebrand's exile with Gregory VI, Bonifacio's gift that doomed him in the end. Piacenza represented it all, and Matilda vowed to cleanse herself of the stains the city represented. Piacenza was far more than a great venue. Piacenza was a statement. And with that, the invitations for the Council of the Century were sent out. Until next time.